Most people think becoming an Amish wife is about learning to bake bread or obey your husband. It's not. The first thing you learn, the brutal truth that exists nowhere in the romanticized photos of horse-drawn buggies, is that your body is no longer your own. It becomes a tool for the community, an instrument of labor so absolute that by the end of my first week of marriage, I quite literally could not stand up from a kneeling position without my sister-in-law hauling me up by my elbows. The pain wasn't a side effect, it was the point. It was the initiation into a life where the erasure of self isn't just spiritual, it's a physical, bone-deep reality. And nobody on the outside ever talks about it. Let me tell you what happened. I need to take you back before the marriage, back to my childhood in Lancaster County, so you can understand the scent of the trap before it snaps shut. You can't understand the shock of becoming a wife unless you understand the strange, protected limbo of being an Amish girl. My world smelled of lye soap, fresh-cut Timothy hay, and the steam rising from a Monday wash kettle. It was a sensory world, not an intellectual one. We didn't have words for psychology or anxiety. We had words for the weather, for the condition of the soil, and for the state of our souls. And as a girl, your soul was always in a state of perilous negotiation. From the time I could walk, I was being shaped into a vessel. My mother's hands, cracked and red from scrubbing, were never idle. As she peeled mountains of potatoes for a Sunday fellowship meal of 400 people, she would tell me, "Sarah, a woman's strength is in her silence, and her glory is in her submission." I'd sit on a little oak stool, my bare feet cold on the linoleum, turning the handle of a cherry pitter, watching the red juice stain my fingers like blood. That was the metaphor, wasn't it? A beautiful, useful sacrifice. My dress was a uniform of erasure. The straight pins, the cape, the apron, they weren't just clothes. They were a theology. The heavy, dark fabric was meant to conceal the curve of a hip or the swell of a breast, because the female form was a dangerous object that could cause a brother to stumble. I learned to despise the mirror. Not because I thought I was ugly, but because looking too long was considered vain, a gateway to the sin of pride. The Ordnung, our unwritten rules, governed everything, down to the number of pleats in my prayer covering. My identity was literally sewn into a dress I didn't design. But here's the secret the tourists who gawk at our quilts don't understand. There was a profound peace in that gilded cage. I knew exactly who I was. My life had a rhythm. The seasons dictated the work. The community dictated the morals. The fear of hell dictated the boundaries. I watched my older sister, Hannah, marry at 19. I saw her transition. One day she was my playmate, sneaking sugar lumps from the pantry. The next, she was a matron, her back bending under a new gravity, her eyes turning inward. She was there, but the girl I knew was gone, replaced by a silent, efficient stranger. I would watch my father bow his head before the silent meal, his beard resting on his chest. He was a good man, a strict man. He believed he was loving us by breaking our will to save our souls. When I was 12, he caught me humming a song I'd heard from an Englisher's car radio, an innocent pop song. He didn't yell. He just looked at me with such deep, mournful disappointment and said, "That is the sound of the world creeping in. Do you want to be like the chaff that the wind drives away?" I didn't want to be chaff. I wanted to be wheat, gathered into the barn safe. I craved the safety. That's the hook they sink deep into your heart. The fear of the outside, the terror of a limitless sky where you might fly too close to the sun and fall into a lake of fire. So I doubled down. I volunteered for the hardest chores. I learned to turn my natural laughter into a soft, contained smile. I was building the cage around myself, smoothing the bars with my own two hands, calling it virtue. I fell in love with the idea of Joseph Lapp not with a wild, dizzying passion, but with a quiet, settled sense of duty. He was a cabinet maker, his hands always smelling of fresh-cut oak. He was solid. He was severe in his kindness. He was the end goal of my entire existence. Marriage wasn't a union of souls. It was a joining of a helpmeet to a provider. The night he asked my father for permission to court me, I didn't feel butterflies. I felt the overwhelming relief of a destiny fulfilled. I was 17. On our wedding day, the house smelled of roasted chicken and celery stuffing. I wore a new blue dress, the color I would wear for the rest of my life now, blue instead of the white of my youth. The ceremony lasted 3 hours. The ministers spoke of the bride in Revelation, pure and unblemished. They didn't speak of joy, they spoke of endurance. And I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, a vessel finally sealed and ready to be used. I was so proud, so ignorant. What could possibly happen, I thought, when you finally achieve the one thing you were created to do? I was about to find out that a vessel's only purpose is to be poured out until it is empty. The morning after the wedding, the sun came up like a hammer wrapped in velvet. I woke in a bed that wasn't my own, in a house that smelled different, a mix of raw wood, male sweat, and the faint ghost of his mother's cleaning. Joseph was already gone, the space beside me cold. A note on the rough-hewn kitchen table, written in pencil on a scrap of paper. Chores are on the list, back from the shop by noon for dinner. Dinner. That's lunch to the English. And I was supposed to have it ready. I didn't feel like a blushing bride. I felt like an intruder who had been handed a manual written in a language I thought I knew but suddenly couldn't read. I looked at the list. It wasn't a list of chores, it was a manifesto. Wash garden weeding. Bread, mend trousers, scrub porch, beat canning. A pit opened in my stomach. This was a test. Not a kind welcome to the family, but a gauntlet thrown down by a centuries-old system designed to break you on day 1 so you'd be useful by day 7. I started with the washing. Now, I need to explain what wash meant on a Monday morning for a young Amish wife in a home without a gas-powered motor yet, because my husband thought they led to worldliness. It meant I had to prime the hand pump outside, filling 3 massive, ribbed aluminum tubs. One for suds, one for blues, one for rinse. The water had to be hauled in buckets, fire built under a copper boiler, and the scalding liquid transferred without burning myself. The sheer physical mechanics of it were a shock. At my mother's house, we worked as a unit, a choreography of sisters. Here I was a solo act. I was dragging heavy, wet denim trousers through a wringer, turning the handle until my shoulder socket screamed with a dull, hot friction. The fabric came out compressed, almost dry, but the real work was the sheets. Amish wedding sheets are heavy cotton, and Joseph's family was traditional. When they got wet, they weighed as much as a small child. Lifting them from the suds to the rinse water was a clean-and-jerk motion that compressed my spine. By 9 in the morning, I was soaked through with a mixture of well water and sweat, the strings of my prayer cap plastered to my neck. But I couldn't stop. Stopping was lazy. Laziness was a sin. The garden weeds were calling, their tiny green heads mocking me from the black soil. I fell to my knees between the rows of young tomatoes, the earth cold and damp seeping through my heavy skirts. And this is the position that became my purgatory. Kneeling. The kneeling prayer in church was supposed to be a respite. This was a crucifixion. The small of my back began to seize, muscles I didn't know I had staging a rebellion. I pulled at chickweed and purslane, my fingernails packed with dirt, my vision blurring. At 11, the panic set in. Bread, I had to make bread, from scratch, no bread machine, no frozen dough. I lurched to my feet, my knees cracking like walnut shells, and staggered to the kitchen. I stoked the wood cookstove, guessing at the temperature by how long I could hold my hand in the oven before the heat forced it back. I mixed the flour, lard, water, yeast, and salt in a massive earthenware bowl, the dough coming together under my hands. Kneading, more kneading. But this was a soothing pain, a rhythmic pressing. I almost wept when I realized I had to let it rise. Time. I had no time. The clock on the mantel, an 8-day wind-up with a tick that sounded like a judge's gavel, said 1:45. Joseph would be home at noon. Noon sharp. I looked at the cold stove, the rising dough, the pile of muddy laundry in the basket. My body was a map of pain. My spine felt fused, my wrists were swollen, and a deep, grinding ache had settled into my hip flexors from the constant kneeling. I had to make dinner. I had to be cheerful. I had to be a wife. I limped to the cold cellar, fetched a jar of last year's chow chow and some smoked sausage. I sliced the sausage, forked the tangy relish, laid out the bread from last week's baking already going stale. When he walked in, silent as a ghost, his boots heavy on the back porch, I was standing at the sink, gripping the cast-iron basin, trying not to faint. The smell of his sawdust mixed with the scent of fried sausage. He sat down. He bowed his head for the silent grace. I sat across from him. We didn't speak. The meal was eaten in 5 minutes of functional, wordless consumption. He drank his coffee. He looked at me. The porch floor needs scrubbing. That was it, that was my first marital conversation. Not how are you? Not what a strange new world this is. A work order, he left. And I, the vessel, turned to fill a bucket with scalding water, ammonia, and lye. I got back on my knees. The wooden slats of the porch dug into my bones. I scrubbed in rhythmic, desperate strokes, the gray water splashing back onto my apron. The sun moved across the sky. The afternoon stretched into an eternity of fatigue. I still had to mend his trousers, a task that required fine motor skills my numb, water-wrinkled fingers didn't possess. I pricked my finger with the needle, drawing a bead of bright red blood that fell onto the dark fabric and disappeared. A perfect little sacrifice, absorbed and unseen. By the time the sun began to dip below the line of the maple trees, signaling the start of evening chores and the dreaded supper preparation, my body had shut down. It wasn't tired, it was in a state of traumatic shock. I had been married for 36 hours, 36, and I still had the evening milking to do. I had to go to the barn, attach myself to the udders of a 1,000-pound animal, and ask for her milk while my own body was running on fumes. My sister-in-law, Rebecca, came by with her husband for the evening meal, a custom I didn't know about. She found me in the barn, leaning my forehead against the warm, coarse flank of a Holstein, tears cutting silent, salty tracks through the grime on my face. I wasn't crying from sadness. I was crying from the sheer, overwhelming violence of the exhaustion. And here is the moment I can trace the fracture back to. Rebecca didn't hug me, she didn't ask if I was okay. She took my arm, her grip like iron, and said, "You need to stand up now, Sarah, the men will be hungry." I tried. I pushed my hand against the sticky barn floor, my legs wouldn't straighten. My knees had locked in a 90-degree angle, a revolt of the cartilage. I pushed harder, a low groan escaping my lips. Nothing. I was stuck, a human crouched in a parody of prayer. I looked up at Rebecca, panic replacing the tears. "I can't," I whispered, the most shameful words a young wife could utter. "I can't stand up." She looked down at me, and for a fleeting second I saw something in her eyes. Not pity, recognition. A flash of her own first week, her own locked joints. But it vanished, replaced by the hard, practical mask of Amish womanhood. She bent down, hooked her hands under my armpits, and with a grunt, hauled me upright. The pain was a white-hot flash as blood rushed back into my deadened legs. I clung to her for a second, my body screaming, my pride shattered. She smoothed down my apron, wiped a smudge of dirt from my cheek with a rough thumb, and said, "You'll get used to it. The body breaks to be rebuilt stronger. That's the Lord's plan." She walked away to the house, leaving me to follow. I took a step. A shard of pain shot up from my arch. I looked down. The soles of my feet, used to going barefoot, were crisscrossed with deep, bloody cracks from the lye in the scrubbing water. I had been walking on open wounds all afternoon and hadn't felt it because the systemic pain was so much louder. That's when the question first formed in my mind, a dark, unbidden thought I tried to push away as a temptation from the devil. If this was God's plan, why did it feel like a punishment for a crime I didn't commit? And what happens to a body when it breaks, but no one lets it be rebuilt? The second week was worse, but in a different way. The shock was replaced by a dull, persistent endurance. The body doesn't break to be rebuilt stronger, as Rebecca said. It breaks and calcifies into a permanently compromised shape. I learned to live with a low-grade thrum of pain in my lower back. I learned to hide the limp from the cracked feet. I became a master of the silent grimace. I was turning into them. My identity was shrinking so fast it felt like a physical compression. Before my wedding, I had a name. Sarah Yoder. A girl who could run through a field of rye, bare feet swift and sure, who could draw little pictures in the dirt with a stick when no one was watching. Now I was just Joseph's wife, or even worse, just an extension of his farm. My value was measured in quarts of canned green beans, in the whiteness of my laundry, in the silence of my tongue during the fellowship meals where I served the men and ate their leftovers. I developed a strange, intimate relationship with the floor. I knew every knot in the pine planks of the kitchen. I memorized the pattern of the linoleum in the washroom, because I was always on it, kneeling. I knelt to scrub. I knelt to pray. I knelt to pull weeds. I knelt to bathe my husband's feet, a ritual of humility that felt less holy and more like a final erasure every time I did it. My world was literally shrinking to a 2-foot-high perspective. I began to dissociate. That's a clinical English word I learned much later. Back then, I called it floating. My body would be wringing a chicken's neck, feeling the frantic flap of wings, the sickening pop of cervical vertebrae, but my mind would be somewhere else. I'd be floating above the scene, looking down at this poor stoic girl in a blue dress, a ghost haunting her own life. I started talking to myself, silent conversations in my head, because if I didn't, I felt I would disappear completely, like mist burning off a morning field. The central myth I was sold was that this suffering was a transaction. I surrender my body and will, and in return, I get safety, community, and salvation. It was the bargain of surrender. But I started to notice the cracks in the transaction. The community was there, yes. They'd raise a barn for you in a day. But they'd also watch you starve emotionally for a lifetime and call it God's peace. The safety was a lie. We were safe from the outside world, but utterly exposed to the crushing weight of internal judgment. One wrong stitch, one whispered hint of vanity, one dish too plain or too fancy at a wedding, and you were the talk of the Sunday evening singings. And salvation. I was working so hard, destroying my body so completely that I had no spiritual energy left. My prayers became as functional as my chores. Lord, help the bread rise. Lord, make the cow's mastitis go away. Lord, let me sleep just one more hour before the rooster crows. I was too exhausted to feel the presence of God. All I felt was the presence of pain and the oppressive, suffocating weight of a life lived 3 feet off the ground. One evening, I remember sitting on the edge of the bed. The only time I was allowed to sit on a chair was during sewing, and rubbing my hands. They were destroyed. The skin was so dry it had split over the knuckles, the nails were cracked and rimmed with dirt no scrubbing could remove, and my palms were a constellation of blisters and calluses. Joseph looked at them. I thought, for one fleeting second, he might reach out and hold them. Instead, he said, "You should put lard on them before bed, so you can grip the scrub brush properly tomorrow." That was the moment the bargain broke. The transaction was void. I had given everything, every ounce of physical function, and the machine simply demanded more. It wanted my soul ground into flour. It wanted my heart pickled and preserved, just another jar in the cold cellar. The question wasn't just, is this all there is? It became a darker, more dangerous question that terrified me to my core. What if the safety they promised isn't safe at all, but a different kind of death? And what if the wild, terrifying world they warned me about held a truth I couldn't see from my knees? My Rumspringa didn't start with a wild party. It started with a library card. I was 18, and a group of us youth had borrowed a buggy to go to the strip mall outside of Ephrata. The others were meeting up with some fancy Mennonites who had a car. I slipped away. I walked into a public library, a building so silent it felt like a church, but the smell was different. It smelled of paper, dust, and possibility, not of lye soap and hay. The librarian, a gentle woman with short, silver hair and a kind smile, a haircut that would get me excommunicated, didn't flinch at my prayer cap and heavy dress. I asked for a book about the human body. I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted to understand the machine that was failing me. She led me to a section of medical texts. I pulled out a book with a transparent overlay of a woman's musculature. I traced the red lines of the muscles, the white cords of the tendons. And there, in the clinical diagrams of a stranger's anatomy, I saw my pain given a name. Repetitive strain injury, bursitis, tendinitis, stress fractures. It wasn't a punishment from God. It was biomechanics. It was physics. It was the predictable outcome of forcing a 17-year-old girl to do the work of a draft horse. That book was my apple in the Garden of Eden. The knowledge didn't bring shame. It brought the first, faint pulse of rebellion. I realized my body wasn't a vessel for the community's use. It was a machine I owned, and I had been running it without oil, without maintenance, until the gears were grinding themselves to dust. I started reading other books. Novels, to be precise. I read Jane Eyre and felt a lightning bolt of recognition. A woman, plain and small, raging against the confines of her life, demanding to be seen as an equal. I read about Florence Nightingale, a woman who took the practical skills of caretaking and elevated them into a profession, a calling on her own terms, not a submission forced upon her. I began to lead a double life. During the day, I was Sarah Lapp, the diligent, aching wife. At night, when Joseph's breathing deepened into sleep, I would go to the outhouse with a candle stub and a forbidden paperback hidden in my apron pocket. I wasn't sleeping around or taking drugs. My rebellion was literacy. My sin was a wandering mind. I started to see the Amish life not as a fortress of faith, but as a factory farm. It was designed for maximum spiritual output with minimum individual resources. It worked beautifully, so long as you never looked up from the furrow. But I had looked up. I had seen the horizon, and I knew I was standing on a treadmill, not a path. The conflict between the two worlds tore me in half. I remember a quilting bee where all the women sat around the frame, their needles dipping and rising like tiny silver birds. The talk was of canning, of childbearing, of a young man who had bought a car and was put under the ban. I sat there, my own needle moving automatically, and I felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign tribe. I loved them. I pitied them. I hated them for their contentment. I was a stranger in my own skin, speaking a language I no longer believed in. The simplicity I once craved now felt like a suffocating blanket. The complexity of the outside world, with its books and its brutal honesty about the human condition, felt like fresh air, even though it terrified me. The final break came on a Tuesday. I had been married for just over 2 years. My body had not healed. My hands were permanently curled into a slight claw. My back ached with the deep, arthritic throb of an old woman. I looked at a calendar and realized with a cold horror that I was still only 19 years old. I had 60 more years of this ahead of me. 60 years of kneeling. 60 years of silence. 60 years of watching my body turn to stone. And I knew, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that I could not survive it. Not my body, but my soul. The girl who drew pictures in the dirt would be completely and utterly extinguished. I didn't leave in a dramatic midnight escape. I left in the middle of the morning while Joseph was at the shop. I had packed a single paper bag with a spare dress, my toothbrush, and my precious desecrated library card. I didn't take the buggy. I walked. I walked down the gravel lane, my cracked feet screaming their familiar song of protest. I walked past the fields of corn, past the one-room schoolhouse where I had learned that the world was a dangerous illusion. I walked to the phone shanty at the end of the road, a little wooden booth we shared with 3 other families. My hands shook so violently I could barely dial the number of the Mennonite woman who I knew sometimes helped girls like me. Girls who were breaking. As the phone rang, I looked back at the valley. It was beautiful. The most beautiful, peaceful, orderly place on God's green earth. And it was a prison designed to break you so completely that you'd kneel down willingly and hand over the key. Leaving wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. I was choosing the terrifying complexity of the unknown over the brutal simplicity of my own slow, kneeling death. The question that had haunted me since that first week in the barn finally had its answer. But leaving was only the first step, and I was about to learn that escaping the cage doesn't teach you how to fly. The modern world hit me like a wall of noise and neon. I stayed with the Mennonite woman, Esther, for a week, and then she helped me get a bus ticket to Harrisburg. The first night in the city, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the cars snake through the streets, their headlights tracing golden rivers on the asphalt. The noise was a physical presence, a constant hum of engines and sirens and distant music. But what struck me most was the anonymity. I could walk down the street in a pair of borrowed jeans and a t-shirt, and nobody looked at me. Nobody knew my father, my district, my shame. I was invisible. And for a girl who had been watched by 100 eyes every second of her life, that invisibility was the most intoxicating freedom I had ever tasted. But freedom was also a brutal education. I had no social security number, no birth certificate that anyone in the English system recognized, no diploma. I was a ghost with a library card. I got a job washing dishes in the back of a diner, and the irony of scrubbing for minimum wage was not lost on me. But this was different. I could stand up when my back hurt. I could take a break. I could go home to my tiny, rented room, a room with a lock on the door, a door no man had the right to walk through, and I could read. I read everything. psychology, philosophy, feminist theory, memoirs of women who had escaped their own cages. I was rebuilding my mind, reframing my trauma, learning that the pain in my body was a language of oppression I had been taught to call virtue. I found a therapist, a kind woman with a nose ring who drank chamomile tea and never once told me to submit. I told her about the barn, about Rebecca hauling me up by the elbows, about the lie eating the skin off my feet. And for the first time in my life, an outsider bore witness to my pain and didn't call it God's will. She called it what it was: abuse. Systemic, theologically sanctioned abuse. I cried for 3 hours straight, and she just sat there, holding a box of tissues, letting me grieve the girl I had been forced to kill inside myself. But healing is not a straight line, it's a spiral. There were days I missed the simplicity so desperately it felt like a physical hunger. I would be overwhelmed by the choices in a supermarket. 50 kinds of cereal. 50. And I would stand there, paralyzed, tears streaming down my face because I didn't know how to want something so trivial. In the Amish world, my choices were made for me. The Ordnung dictated my cereal, my clothes, my husband, my thoughts. Now I had to build a self from scratch, a self who had preferences, desires, and boundaries. And building a self is the hardest work there is. I got a GED. I went to community college. I discovered I had a voice, not just for speaking, but for writing. A professor told me I had a unique perspective, a story that mattered. I started writing about the farm, the washing, the kneeling, the bloody cracks in my feet. It was a memoir, but it was also an exorcism. Every word I typed was a tiny act of defiance, a declaration that my body was mine, that my story was mine. That I was no longer a vessel to be used, but a woman to be heard. Today I sit in a comfortable chair in my own apartment, typing on a laptop. I have a cat named Voltaire who has never once cared if my dress is the right length. I have friends who love me not for my utility, but for my chaos. My body still carries the scars. The hands are still gnarled. The back still aches when it rains, but I have reframed that pain. It is no longer a mark of submission. It is a memorial. It reminds me that I survived a system designed to erase me. The simple life promised peace, but it delivered a living death. The complex life, the one I chose, is messy and uncertain and often terrifying, but it is mine, and I walk through it on 2 feet, imperfectly healed but standing. We live in a world that constantly tries to sell us on simplicity. Declutter your house. Optimize your routine. Reduce your life to a manageable, Instagram-worthy aesthetic. But I am here to tell you that the cult of simplicity can be a trap. The Amish are not the only ones who demand you kneel. Every system that asks you to surrender your critical thinking for a sense of safety, every relationship that asks you to erase your boundaries for a promise of love, every job that asks you to destroy your body for a paycheck, these are all just different versions of the same bargain. The bargain of surrender. I couldn't stand during my first week as an Amish wife. My body gave out under the weight of a tradition that saw me as nothing more than an engine for reproduction and labor. But that moment of collapse in the barn, that moment when Rebecca had to drag my broken body off the floor, was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. It was the seed of a question that grew into a life. A question I now ask you. Where in your life have you been kneeling for so long that you've forgotten you have the strength to stand? Maybe it's not your knees that ache, but your spirit. Maybe it's not a husband's work order, but a boss's impossible demands. Maybe it's not the Ordnung, but the silent, crushing pressure of a society that tells you your worth is in your output. Wherever you are, whatever form that floor takes beneath your aching knees, I want you to hear me. The body breaking is not the Lord's plan. It is a warning light. It is your deepest self screaming to be heard. You were not put on this earth to be a vessel for someone else's purpose. You were put here to stand upright, to walk your own crooked path, and to tell your own complicated, beautiful story. The pain is not the point, the standing up is. So look at your hands. They are yours. Look at your feet. They are yours. And they were made, not for kneeling forever, but for rising. Most people think becoming an Amish wife is about learning to bake bread or obey your husband. It's not. It's about learning that your body is a cathedral, not a tool. And the only person who gets to decide how that cathedral is used is you. I couldn't stand during my first week as an Amish wife, but I can stand now. And so can you.